So, it's no secret by now that I'm taking a break from Gundam Battle Operation 2. As I said before, if I wasn't such a huge Gundam fan, I probably would not have stuck with it for as long as I did. If you're a longtime fan of the franchise, it can be frustrating looking for a good game with the Gundam name on it, especially if you're in the US where we only have access to some of the games. Even if someone does find a game that they like, there's usually some flaw or limitation that they need to overlook. There's usually a big but in talking about what Gundam game fans consider to be good. SD Battle Alliance is one such example. It's actually not a bad game, but if you're not into the SD aesthetic, then it might break your immersion. And if you don't speak Japanese, then it can be a little difficult to read the instructions being given to you during gameplay while you're trying to stay alive. There's also the amount of grinding it practically requires you to do. Back in the 2000s, there were several games released for the PlayStation 2 here in the US. Like GBL2, these games usually came with their fair share of problems. As a fan, you might force yourself to see past the issues. Journey to Jaburo, for example, allowed you to play through some of the early stories from the original Gundam series. But its gameplay was terrible, even by the standards of the time. Encounters in Space, like the name suggests, allowed you to play in space, and also had a large selection of mobile suits. But its gameplay felt much like a rail shooter. There was also a mode where you can create your own character. Unfortunately, it was very limited in what you can do with it. Zeonic Front had some fairly unique gameplay, similar to Rise from the Ashes back on the Sega Dreamcast. But its gameplay was not for everyone. Gundam Federation vs. Zeon and Gundam vs. Zeta Gundam had maybe the most consistent gameplay, but they were more arcade-like games than anything else, with their missions being more or less the same. And you'll often find yourself playing on the same maps repeatedly. There was also Battle Assault 3 and Never Ending Tomorrow. I played all these games extensively back then. At the end of the day, my overall impressions were that maybe on the next generation of consoles, they'll improve on what worked in these games, and we'll finally get something that could be universally considered to be a good Gundam game. And this is where we sort of have to ask ourselves, what exactly would a good, quote-unquote, good Gundam game look like? If you're a big fan of the Dynasty Warrior games, then maybe for you, that good Gundam game was one of the Gundam Dynasty Warrior games. I tried getting into them back in the day, but I just couldn't. And believe me, I tried. I really did try. There was also Gundam Crossfire on the PlayStation 3, but I didn't have a PS3 back then, so I never got to play it. And whenever I heard people talk about it, it mostly consisted of negative reviews. These, of course, were the small selection of games we had access to here in the US. Over in Japan, where Gundam is from, they, of course, had more to choose from, which makes sense. The Japanese market should come first for Gundam. I don't think anyone is going to logically argue against that. This, however, brings up a second question. Would Japanese players and Western players want the same thing when it comes to deciding what would make for a good Gundam game? As of now, and for the past few decades, maybe the closest to a good mech game might be Armored Core. And Armored Core 6 is the best-selling game of the series so far. Might it be enough to keep Gundam fans satisfied? Maybe. Just imagine playing the game with a Gundam skin cover on top of the graphics. But the mobile suits from Gundam don't exactly move like that. And so, maybe it won't exactly be enough to just have FromSoftware develop a Gundam game.
That's not entirely accurate.
What? Which part?
Actually, FromSoftware did make a Gundam game back in 2012. From what I've been able to read online, it appears that the game is actually pretty solid. Unfortunately, it was never released in the US. You can import it, but if you don't know how to read Japanese, then getting through the menus might prove difficult. And here's another question. Do players want another game where we replay through some of the various episodes and moments of the franchise? Similar to how just about every single Dragon Ball Z game keeps retelling the exact same story. Even Xenoverse retold all of the same stories over and over again. And it seems that developers either don't want to try an original story in the Dragon Ball universe, or maybe it's because they're not allowed to. In the case of Gundam, however, would an original story be preferable? If it's an original story, then, to be honest, I don't think FromSoftware could really make a universally praised Gundam game. Storytelling is not one of FromSoftware's strengths. Elden Ring, Dark Souls, and even Armored Core are some great games, and even iconic, but none are remembered for their stories. There are some interesting parts to them, but I personally don't think their storytelling style would mesh all that well with Gundam. And I also personally don't want a game where the majority of the story is told to me through audio logs and exposition dialogue that happens during gameplay. Except maybe for whenever the main character and villain loudly debate their ideologies while in the middle of a fight.
If I feared for my life, I would never have dared to give you the psycho-freight data. What? My victory would be meaningless if you only had a second-rate mobile suit. Even so, this has become absurd.
Such a snob. Haven't you learned anything? Why do you always have to look down on other people?
To some players, story may not be all that important. I completely understand not caring so much about story and just wanting to jump into a mobile suit or mech and shoot some dirty space noids from Xeon. But my guess is that if you're a big-time Gundam fan, then story is important to you. Mobile Suit Gundam is of course a lot more than just giant robots fighting in space wars. Regardless if it's from the Universal Century or After Colony, or the Cosmic Era, or even in AD, there are characters and ideologies clashing with one another. In the course of me just letting my mind wander about just what in the world would a good Gundam game look like, I came to one possible issue that Bandai and any developer attempting to make such a game might run into, and that is which timeline should they focus on. The Universal Century might seem like the obvious choice to some, but it is the one that might require some homework for potential new players since there's so much history to catch up on. And if the story takes place earlier in the timeline, such as during the One-Year War, then newer fans of the series might be scratching their heads, wondering, why is there no Unicorn Gundam? And more casual fans might be asking, where's Wing Zero? This is something that they've attempted to solve by creating games where the story is about the alternate universes of Gundam clashing with one another. It's almost as if though, the success of such a long-lasting property like Gundam that has various alternate timelines has made it difficult to be able to focus on one main story for a video game. And so, there are also the various Gundam games that don't in fact focus on any of the stories and either make it a versus online game with practically no single-player campaign, or a breaker game that's more focused on allowing you to create your own Gundam and showing it off to friends. My personal opinion for what I think a good Gundam game could look like is one where they focus more on gameplay and narrative for a solid single-player experience. Reduce the number of mobile suits so that more time could be spent on polishing everything else, and not waste time trying to get some 300 different mobile suits in. Instead, give us some 3 to 5 different playable mobile suits for a main campaign that each has different customization and appearance options. And for the story, maybe have it take place in a setting similar to Turn A Gundam, which already sort of connects the various universes. That way, if mobile suits from alternate timelines are going to appear alongside one another, there's already sort of an explanation for it. Just have some vague hints of some ancient catastrophic event to explain why there are some old mobile suits buried across the world. And if there is going to be multiplayer, focus more on co-op instead of competitive multiplayer. Going back to SD Battle Alliance, it actually does have co-op, and the gameplay is also pretty solid. No real story if I am to be honest. There's what can be considered an outline for a plot, but it's really just there to give an excuse for all the different universes colliding. And really, SD Battle Alliance, along with other games, continues the long tradition of making players scratch their heads and ask, why would they do that? Even Cold Fairy falls under this. It has some good presentation as far as character cutscenes, but the story feels odd at best. And for a Gundam game with Gundam in its name, you don't play as a Gundam pilot, but as a Xeon pilot. So, for a casual fan who may have been on the ropes deciding if they should try the game, seeing a Zaku on the cover may have turned them off from giving it a shot. Gameplay-wise, it's nothing difficult if you're used to playing GBO2. And I do prefer the slower combat when it comes to mobile suit fights, instead of it feeling more like a fighting game. But it's just another miss for me in the long run. Maybe if Cold Fairy was released at the exact same time as the multiplayer and were packaged together as a complete game, then perhaps it would have gotten more recognition. An added co-op mode for the campaign and an English dub could have also helped greatly. Unfortunately, we live in the universe where the multiplayer was released 2 years before the story. looking at how things have been for decades now, I'm not sure if we'll ever get that universally good Gundam game. But I do look forward to the day that I'm proven wrong. Now, there is a long list of Gundam games that I haven't mentioned, and to be honest, that list is pretty long, so there's no way I'm going to get to them in just one video. Maybe to some, one of those games is actually considered a good Gundam game, and maybe for some, that's enough.